Shankar. Good to meet you once again. So I like we sort of discussed a whole host of things, and I don't consider myself any kind of scholar. Most of my understanding of what constitutes our traditions, or what survives as Indian traditions, or what we might describe as Hinduism, is more out of my reading various books that are written in English, and it's an ongoing learning experience. I would say, at least my understanding just now is in its very basic infant state, and when I look at the kind of knowledge that exists in our tradition, it is so vast and extensive. That you start thinking in terms of its size, you'll get intimidated and probably go back, shrink back to how we exist. But it's so much more enjoyable just to sort of explore. That whole journey is so enjoyable at a very, very personal level. So in that context, I thought there were some ideas that I sort of kept in my mind, debating over. In none of these, I have very strong views, or I've got an inclination to go one way or the other. But I thought this conversation with you will both be educative for me and hopefully for those listening in. Um,
Understanding emerges. So
yes, yes.
we have to disagree, debate.
But the whole idea is to sort of understand and learn more, and to test those gray areas, or at least in a lot of our heads in the public space, what might be viewed as gray areas, where I say a lot of the traditional Indian right doesn't want to deal with the gray area. We want to pretend that it does not exist. My thought is that through these conversations that I might have with you is to sort of push those lines, to pose them in the manner, ask them in a very stark fashion, so that it is clear that they are answers to these questions. I mean, we can start a discussion with what is Hinduism in a certain sense, because current narrative as we see today is that what we consider Hinduism today is actually very bhakti tradition in its orientation. It's a strange kind of bhakti tradition. It is sort of it is based on faith and belief rather than an actual experience of a deity, or of a devta, or of anything above that level. So it's very, in that sense, it's got a Semitic flavor to it, the way we look at our bhakti today. So I thought the first part of a discussion could actually address uh, this one element, is that we have got this Puranic bhakti kind of sense, and in another context we have some sense that uh, the Vedas, we are a Vedic tradition, so very often we say this is a Vedic tradition, but our practiced religion is more Puranic. And so it's also to sort of, I thought maybe it is worthwhile to understand the different strands that formed what we now consider a bit of a khichdi, which we might call Hinduism, but each one of those were very different from each other. And so when we talk in terms of any form of Hindu unity, it is not as a Christian unity, Islamic unity. We are actually very, very different. We enjoy the interface with each other. So it's more than just tolerance or acceptance of another viewpoint. It is how you enjoy that interaction, because the whole interaction's purpose is to raise the level of understanding. And so, therefore, what truly is what you might what has now come to be defined as Hinduism? The ancient, we had something which was called the Astika and an Astika aspect of our tradition. Astika being, rather than saying believers in God, was more people who accepted the prevalence or the predominance of the Vedas, and the Nastikas were the ones that rejected the Vedas. In the Astika traditions, there are probably five or six basic schools of Astika tradition. So I wanted to sort of discuss that with you. And essentially, and different from Nastika, Nastika also has got different schools in it. But my sense from whatever I have read and learned and discussed is that each of these traditions are so different from each other that sometimes Judaism, Islam, and Christianity are closer as theologies than each one of these schools. Vedic and Upanishadic, at least in my from what I've understood, go hand in hand, are fairly close. Then they talk about a Puranic tradition as if it is so different and disconnected from the Vedic, that its underlying basis is very different. And then you have more in, I would say, in peninsular India or southern India, eastern India, is that they are the Agma and the Tantra traditions. So they tend to say that we are different from the Vedic, and you find a lot of that debate amongst Tamilians in particular, who say that Agama is different and the Vedics are trying to dominate over us. And but it's not as if it is baseless completely. Like some of our sort of commentators that are more Vedic in their orientation would like to say that that is completely baseless. It may not be as baseless, so they might be, that sort of comment might be in a shade of gray. The third is very often when we're talking about ancient India, lot of our discourse, and we put some historicity to it. Lot of our discourse is what happened in North India, what was the Harappan civilization about, what happened at the Gangetic Plain. And it seems as if the historicity goes to sort of maybe 3000 BC, 4000 BC, depending upon where you would like, but it is mostly concentrated on the north. A lot of the scriptures are northern in their orientation. And particularly when you look at books of history, they tend to suggest that maybe South India civilization started only in maybe 500 BC or 1000 BC, though there's archaeological find to sort of challenge those notions. But there is also that. And my question is not historic in nature. My question is in terms of religious tradition. Is that was there a robust religious tradition which goes back as much or even further as you would say the Vedic traditions in the north? And was it a slightly different tradition in the south, which therefore blended? The other thing is just the good guy and the bad guy. I mean, we tend to think of the terms of Rakshasas, Asuras, but when you use the term Hindu the way we use it, actually all of them are also Hindus. They are not worshipping Allah, but maybe the distinction between good guy and bad guy is not as stark as it is in the Semitic theologies. Um, and we have a more gray area where the good guys do a set of bad things and a bad guys do a set of good things, and it's all of our tradition. But there also seems to be a bit of a north and south to it. But the first question, if we could sort of start with the Astika traditions, how different they might be, the Nastika, how different, and each one of these, as I understand, is very, very ancient.
Yes. It's as usual very nice getting together with you.
Yes.
Uh,
Thank you.
so yeah, I largely agree. I think probably a little bit of difference, but largely I agree with the perspective you have taken. Hinduism of late has become more faith centered, or the majority of its practice has become faith oriented. It's only a minority that are actually really into its seeking systems, synthesizing the knowledge, and invested in the inner sheets of the tradition, if you want to call it that, where the real synthesis of knowledge, the orthopraxy, all these are there. Majority are largely detached. So if we see that in terms of koshas, you have that innermost sheath where the rigorous knowledge tradition exists. Then you have an outer sheath where it is less philosophy centric and more practice centric. And you have yet another outer sheath where even the practice is not rigorous. It is just a loose belief that binds you to the inner sheath. So there is that kind of concentric sheaths where the influence keeps exerting. That's one way to look at it, and that is how society also is in general. You have the more formal structures of social order, then you have more loose sheets, then you have the forest kind of life where it is very loose. There is no tight system of governance or anything. Then you have still farther sheets, like let us say the sannyasis are there, those where you don't even have a very rigorous life code for them you can do. So in that sense, This koshas, the way an individual has the five koshas, probably also makes sense for us to see the tradition and the society, traditional society in the form of koshas. Then we will probably also relate very easily what sheath is prone to the maximum change, where the synthesis happens, where the reform happens, where corrections happen, where evolutionarily, if this organism is changing, how it is taking inputs and how it is evolving at what level. So, in that sense, if we see, and then this is one aspect. The other aspect is it is an ecosystem of traditions. Right? If you contrast it with a religion has a fundamental hypothesis which you accept or you reject. If you accept, you are an insider, you are a believer. If you don't, then you are an outsider. So basically, there is a vertical split in the world between the believers and the non believers. But here, every tradition is an infaced tradition. All its content is meant only for the insiders. It doesn't have anything for the outsider in terms of how they should be dealt with or things like that. But all the traditions do have some common understanding and common agreements. Let us say they broadly three. One is the bodhana or the pedagogy, where the learning system happens. So each of these is a teacher disciple lineage. So it has its own pedagogy, and then how you propound your theory. There is a vadana or the argumentation, nyaya or the system of argumentation is the second subject, where everybody has some common agreement. All the traditions have this because that is how they engage and they harmonize and they enrich each other. Third is probably the epistemology. While each tradition may have its own accepted pramanas and all that, the fact that you have to have these pramanas, you have to spell out what your epistemic bases are for your hypothesis. So all these three are assumed to be common are some things that every school contributes to the ecosystem, and that is how all schools communicate with each other. That way, we have created an ecosystem where traditions can come, they can propound their theories, they can expand, they can spread, they can refute other theories, and then they have their life cycle. Eventually, they dissolve into the ecosystem without a lot of baggage left. As a result of this, what happens is whenever a school dissolves back into the mainstream, you don't have the social trauma dealt with how a system collapses and all that. The practitioners just pick up other practices, other traditions, and the knowledge that is contributed by this tradition remains forever. Any permanent contribution remains without that tradition actually becoming a baggage. Let us say today nobody knows. There is no first-hand practitioner of Sankhya. But whereas we know that the knowledge of Sankhya, the Trigunas, the 24 principles, all these are used across now Vedantins, the Vaidikas, the Tantrikas, Agamikas, everybody uses this knowledge. And everybody understands that this is a Sankhya contribution. Nobody denies it, but at the same time, it is so dissolved into the common ecosystem. And that is how things in general work in this ecosystem. The contribution that is there. And then there are so many other traditions which have probably not so much of knowledge contribution. If you take, for instance, Harihara Advaita, nobody hears that name anymore, but it was very vital in certain regions in dissolving the Shaiva Vaishnava bad blood. And after that contribution, it has dissolved. There was poetry at that time, there were treatises at that time, but they were all temporal. At that time, they served their purpose. Now it had done its work, it has now dissolved. So that's how this ecosystem works in general. So
just pausing for a second. It is just to sort of understand and sort of focus a little more on Sankhya itself. Because one is, I've always wondered whether there's something to the name when you say Sankhya. Is it indicative of a mathematical, philosophical underpinning to the...
mathematical, enumerative. Sankhya is number, right? So it is basically enumerating.
Yes.
It is enumerating the 24 principles that are underlying the creation.
Right. So and where I come from is very often when you're in discourses with practitioners of different kinds. They will say that temple construction, which is the Agama Shastra for temple construction. They will talk about Ayurveda. They will talk about astrology. They will say, or yoga. They will talk about all of those are derived from Sankhya, and they will say that the underlying foundation, the foundation for these practices are Sankhya. And I've always wondered, particularly in the context of Ayurveda, also when you talk in terms of just how idols are created, or how the murtis are created, how temples are created, the sort of the design that is there. I'll first touch upon my understanding of Ayurveda, and then in the context of Sankhya, and then I'll talk about the temple sort of architecture, the murti creation in the context of Sankhya. I've always wondered, and this is something that people would sort of, your regular history would teach you, that mankind grew by trial and error. And when I think in terms of Ayurveda, the question has always bothered me as to how old can trial and error be? So, for example, let's say Christ was born 2000 years back. How much evolution have we seen in Christianity in the last 2000 years? And if you look at the level of intricacy and the detail that exists in, say, Ayurveda, you look at the combinations that they've come up with for various diseases, for how it has got to be many times older than just 2000 years. Because given just its lifespan, Christianity has not been able to come up with those levels of understanding, whereas Ayurveda has. Now, there's also a common thought process or saying that everything has got a aushadhi element to it. So everything is capable of being medicine or medicinal. For some of the traditional Ayurvedic physicians, they will say that every disease has there's a solution, there's a medicine for every disease. You have to determine where the problem is and what the problem is. Once you are able to identify the problem, treatment is just a matter of, is a very quick thing.
Yeah.
Now, it's at least my sense, underlying sense is it would have had too much of trial and error, and none of our scriptures talk about a trial and error method. So there has to be a slightly different method. You can't just superimpose trial and error just because modern science in the last 200 years grew by trial and error. So my sense, and this is the question that I had, is that does Sankhya work on the basis that if you combine certain gunas, etc., that this will be, so you can, before you actually test it, you can predict that this is the outcome, and then you test the outcome on an animal or a human being, and I'm talking purely in the Ayurvedic context, is that you can, at some level of meditative state, you can figure out the gunas of certain material or certain plants, and you can figure out the way it will interact with a certain human being, let's say human being for this particular case, and you look at the guna of the human being, you look at the characters of the human being, and that is how they get a sense for this is where the treatment might lie. But there is a clear methodology to how they do it. I mean, we may not fully appreciate it, but methodology will mean that there is logic to it. Logic will mean that because, again, when you come to Ayurveda, they have clear proportions for how you will mix it or mix things. So there seems to be some measurement as well when they think in terms of these. And Ayurveda is not necessarily only administering something orally. I mean, it is also about touching points in your body or getting you to sit in a certain posture or asana. So there it comes at multiple levels. There has to be a method to a madness. It can't just be trial and error.
So once we get to drug, that is one aspect. But as you said, Ayurveda's philosophy goes deeper, right? So its basic principle is you have to improve the vitality of the body.
Yes.
So that it can overcome the ailment.
Yes.
So the whole medicinal philosophy is oriented towards how do you improve the vitality. As
True.
part of that, yes, drugs are there, but yeah, and when you talk of drugs, obviously the chemical compositions are there, the experiments are there, how do you record the experimental results, all this is there. You can't call experiment a trial and error. because there is a basis on which you choose an experiment. It's a fairly logical basis. It's not just random.
Absolutely.
And that applies to all forms of science. And it's equally valid in physical chemistry, pharmacology, as well as the Ayurveda.
True, true.
But here, slightly, there are more dimensions to it. Number one, probably we don't work with the chemical, we work with the entire compound, or more than compound, we say it's substance itself. Let us say there is a plant. It is the plant product we use rather than the chemical. We don't prefer capsule made out of that plant rather than, because we believe that the magic formula lies in that organic substance rather than the extracted physical inorganic substance. So that's part of reason why the herbs are used in a more direct form than the modern medicine.
So which is what you're trying to say, probably, if I may paraphrase it, it is rather than just use the Annamaya kosha of the plant, is to use the other koshas in which the plant might exist.
You can explain it even at a purely chemical physical level, because that magic combination is not just that one chemical. What comes with that life form is a more complex formula.
Yes, yes.
And all of which you can't independently or individually manufacture and then achieve that magic combination. So let us say. But this part can be explained even at the physical chemical level.
So I was asking, my question was slightly one level deeper, which is when somebody adds say two plants together, just for a simple example, two plants together, there has got to be some information, like in modern physics, you know that certain chemicals work in a certain manner with each other. So you predict and therefore you do it. A lot of our Ayurvedic development must have been somewhat similar, where people have a hypothesis, that hypothesis is based on something, and then they predict and then they test it.
Yes. Because when you say Sankhya, but Sankhya's influence is there in terms of gunas, the primal gunas, it propounds the tanmatras. These affect every subject, and Ayurveda is similarly because it has to do with the prana.
So my question was the essence of measurement for all these gunas. So is Sankhya somewhat indicative of a science rather than a philosophy? Of a science
No, that is not Sankhya, because primarily the three gunas.
Okay.
The 9 gunas, the combination of elements, this is not as much derived from Sankhya itself. Probably, but you have again, it's not more than darshanas.
Right.
You have the more logical aspects of the Vaiseshika, Nyaya, all these things.
Right.
And Ayurveda is,
So if I sort of move away from Ayurveda, and if we talk in terms of temple, because temples are clearly by measurement. Our murtis are by I mean, whether you use a dhyana shloka for a murti, etc., is how do you do it? And one of the objections that I've always had to how we approach, I mean, we look at the visual beauty, and we say, oh, so beautiful. And a lot of Indians think of Indian tradition as part of our culture. Yes, it is part of our culture, but it is reflective of so much more than just culture. So there is an underlying science that is missed, and the science talks to, at least in the Indian system, art is not just art in a visual sense. You can, before you make the thing, you know that it will appeal to a lot of people. So there is a underlying science to creation of what is now viewed as art. So whether a murti looks one way or looks another way, the kind of garments or the kind of jewelry that a murti might have, or if you look at a temple, how the temple is constructed, the kind of sculpture that you might sort of have in and around it, the various idols, the demigods, etc. There is a clear logical reason why it exists, as against Michelangelo just makes sculptor for the sake of
Yes.
beauty, physical beauty. Here, there is an underlying logic to why it is being made in that particular fashion. And again, there is a lot of measurement that is involved with it.
True. So yeah, that is there. And okay, if you go back to the Veda itself, there is a very elaborate kalpa, which is a Vedanta, where you see the proportions, the measurement, how you combine things. So in the context of astronomy, in the context of mathematics, in the context of how you design the Vedi, the Vedashala, that, and so it is there all over. And obviously that Yajnashala, that is the base from which your temple has later evolved. So architecturally, there is a continuation between these things. And okay, Ayurveda is there, then your alchemy is there, where the
Yes.
rasa is
Yes.
what they call it, where the chemical compositions are created partly for medicinal use, partly for other purposes also. These things have existed and they have seen a parallel stream of development. So partly as part of this Vedanga, then in the Agama you see the development, in the Tantra you see development. There has been a parallel development, all these things. And all these subjects have been useful in, let us say, Ayurveda or Jyotisha, or no, the other example you took is the temple. So there are these separate subjects, right? I mean, we can't call them really subjects, they are interdisciplinary in their nature. What I'm trying to get at is you have these darshanas, the Sankhya, all these things. They are giving you a philosophy of how to approach things. And more so how to understand the world. Each darshana is a window to the world. One says understand world, one says understand qualities of the being. So that way,
Right.
this is one stream, but orthogonally you have a lot of exact sciences or the subjects that deal with your day-to-day matters, measurements, the chemical compositions and things like that. So all this put together is becoming your knowledge body.
So if we move away from Sankhya, so there is Sankhya, at least it has got a certain approach to it, and lots of people think of it very differently. I think some history, if you just sort of search around for it, some will say that it accepts the idea of a god, some will say that it does not accept the idea of a god. Maybe
Yes,
that's
both.
a function of how it has grown
In
over.
fact, there are both. There is a Seshwara Sankhya, there is a Nirishwara Sankhya also.
Yeah.
Nirishwara is remaining now, but earlier versions both were there.
Yeah. And then I can't claim to know the next two schools, either Nyaya or Vaisheshika, so much. What I do know is the perceptor, so to say, of Sankhya might be Kapila Muni, of Nyaya might be Gautama, of Vaisheshika, I'm not exactly sure.
Another, I think.
Yeah. So I'm not sure of these two, but if we move further, so if we say there is yoga, and if there is Vedanta, and Vedanta then has three separate sects as well, but yoga is also seen as a separate school or a separate darshana in itself. And as I understand it, all these darshanas are mentioned in one way or the other in the Vedas themselves. So it's not as if these darshanas, as I understand it, come out outside of the Vedas, but they are actually embedded in the Vedas. So if we look at yoga seems to talk in terms of a merger of different things. Yoga is just a combination, just loose English language, sort of things coming together, a blending of something. We tend to think of yoga as Hatha Yoga, but it's probably so much more than just Hatha Yoga. But then there is the school of yoga, which is a little more tilted in the direction of bhakti. So there is Bhakti Yoga, but there are other elements to yoga as
So,
well.
if we take a step back, we'll be able to wire it better.
Yeah.
Continuity we can establish better, probably.
Yeah.
Let us say, when we say that this is an ecosystem of traditions. Now, the darshanas have a wide contribution, each of them. While each of them is an approach to life and how to realize oneself and all that, each of these has one fundamental contribution to the common corpus of knowledge. So, Nyaya has contributed logic, Mimamsa has contributed analysis, Vaiseshika has contributed again how to understand the tattva, how to break down into basic principles and things like that. Sankhya is enumerative. And Sankhya is the primal Jnanamarga, in fact. How you understand the essence of the world so that you can achieve the greater happiness.
Right.
Similarly, the Mimamsa, along with analysis, it has also contributed the philosophy of action, the karma, yoga, all these things. Then you have the Vedanta, which is it says all that you have so far talked of is the world, is Vishwamimamsa. But leaving all this is what you get, what you should ultimately get. So let's focus on that. That is what the Vedanta is saying. So it has basically created another frame of reality altogether. So that is what Vedanta has contributed.
So as I was understanding it, so yoga is, I practiced Hatha Yoga in the past, so I have a bit of a sense for yoga beyond just what it is. But
so yoga has several aspects. One is as a darshana, what Patanjali propounds and says, this is how you realize. These are the methods to achieve what Sankhya is setting as a goal. So that is why yoga is almost always associated with Sankhya as a philosophy. So once you have refuted Sankhya, you have refuted yoga also.
Right. So more like a practiced part of the
Sankhya.
It's like having a recipe and then going into the kitchen and cooking the meal.
Exactly. That is the yoga. And which is why yoga has such a pervasive presence across schools. So now today the most famous practice in the practicing aspect of the philosophy that you have today is Archa Marga.
Right.
People do that puja in their house. You do it in temple. You do it as an individual in groups. It's the most pervasive single form of practicing Hinduism today is the Archa Marga. And that itself has internally adopted so many yogic elements. Your Mantra Marga has yoga in it. Nada Yoga has yoga in it. Then you have Hatha Yoga is there. Nada anyway is there. Apart from that, there is a Laya Yoga where your Raja Yoga, all these things come. Then you have a Kundalini Yoga. So there are so many flavors of it. And a lot of these Smarta as well as Agama Tantra schools adopt a lot of yogic elements. There is probably today no single school that does not have any yoga element. Every single school has some or the other part of yoga in it.
Right.
So in that sense, it is giving you methods for practice that everybody understands. Just like Sankhya has given you 3 gunas and the 24 principles, all these things, yoga has given this. And this again is used in every school. It's not as if there is one yoga school which is going to rival with one Vedanta school.
Right.
Vedanta doesn't mind using any yoga practices. Shankara also has written a Yoga Dharavali itself, combining so many yoga paths. So that's how our ecosystem is. It is very harmonious and mutually enriching.
So if we look at the next one, it is Mimamsa. And Mimamsa is this sort of the from at least my understanding, please correct me if I'm wrong, it's more ritualistic in its approach. So it's probably of the various darshanas the highest in terms of ritualism. And that is the school where Madana Mishra was, with whom Adi Shankara had the debate. And as they're debating, as you read the debates, you also see that there are some underlying features, but there is also that stark difference between just the approach that the two are coming from. Adi Shankara from one side and Madana Mishra from the other side, and his wife then take it to another level.
Bharati.
Bharati. But it is just how the schools, while their similarities are so different as well from each other, is that there is a fairly heated debate in terms of just how, and as the debate is described historically. We keep mentioning that we were a debating society, scholars would debate with each other. Whether there were similar debates between scholars of, and I don't know the answer to this, scholars of Sankhya and Nyaya, between Nyaya and Vaisheshika, between Vaisheshika and Yoga.
In fact, after Nyaya was refuted, it was reinstated as a Navya Nyaya. They came up with new hypothesis.
Right.
They didn't want the school to die because it has so much of contribution to make.
Yeah.
Whereas Sankhya, they have just sucked it out and left the skeleton out.
Right.
So now there is nothing, no tradition called Sankhya or anything. Whereas Nyaya traditions have actually survived.
Right.
Because Tarka is, you use it in day-to-day logic. But if you see the Mimamsa and Vedanta, Mimamsa is basically Karma Yoga, right? Because that is. Kumarila had reinstated Vedamata by refuting Bauddha. And then Shankara comes and refutes Mimamsa to establish the Vedanta.
Right.
Basically, the Vedanta is what they saw as the sustaining principles for the traditions.
And then the last one that I would say, which is Vedanta, and very often,
and which is also where you see the harmony. While there was so much of the argument, and then Shankara won over and converted Sureshwara, in fact. But in one stroke, he says, for everything that belongs to Vyavahara, you have to take Kumarila Bhatta's word as the final authority. So everything that if you need to understand the world, you have to go by Bhatta. Only when it comes to Brahman, you need to go to Vedanta.
Right.
So basically, the ritual is there, but the ritual ultimately is, probably a very literal way of looking at Mimamsa. Mimamsa, its essence is it is propounding the Karma Yoga, which is looking at the whole world as a yajna in itself. So if you perfect action, you have perfected yourself, because all that you are doing is action in the world. That is where the Karma Yoga, and so you break it down into its basic ingredients. The inspiration for action, the subsidiary rights are there, then you have the other ingredients that are involved, the results that you are getting, how much you are focused on the result versus the procedure versus the ingredients. So this is how, understanding all this is how you perfect action.
Right.
And perfection of action along with the inspiration. And that is how one is evolving from within.
Right. In this context, and specifically, just a side question, and maybe it's useful to sort of pose that as well, is that the Indian tradition of debate is not necessarily the way it is projected today by the peace-loving guys.
Okay.
So it is not a tradition of peace in that sense. As peace understood today. So the way these debates would happen is one side would win, the other had the option of either accepting the winner's underlying basis or drowning themselves in a river or in a well. And I don't know to what extent it is true. But this has been, I've been told this by many.
There were cases. In fact, if you see Ashtavakra's case, there was such thing.
Yeah.
That was a condition of debate. But these conditions are decided earlier itself. And
true.
It's not that majority went like that. There were all kinds.
True.
But more than I agree with you in that the peace aspect, it's not basically peace or anything, but integrity was there. One who loses really loses. It's not as if you lose an argument here, start propagating somewhere else.
Correct. Absolutely.
So, integrity was given utmost importance.
Absolutely. And so somebody once described it and said, in the Sadhu tradition, it is also seen that Adi Shankara has caused the deaths of so many people, because many people ended up drowning themselves rather than converting.
That's not what we gather from the Shankara Vijaya. In fact, we don't see too many deaths because he argued with almost every kind of tradition.
And so most converted to what he...
But even if you lose...
accepted his logic.
So it's like this: you lose, fine, but it does not mean that you have to leave your faith, convert, or anything. But you just lose the credibility to propagate this view anymore.
Okay.
That is the fundamental thing, right? I mean, once your hypothesis is lost, you can't keep propagating.
Right.
So that is how the debate curtails propagation of fraudulent hypotheses.
Right.
Within the ecosystem, if you see.
Right.
Now, each person, based on his own ego levels and all that, can go put any bet on it, right? I will die if I lose and all that. That is based on individual character.
Right.
It's primarily about your, now you lose it, let us say. You know that this is a weak hypothesis. You will work on it to improve the hypothesis. So over centuries, people refined their argument so much. You see Vedanta 3000 years ago and Vedanta today, the arguments have refined so much over several generations. So several re-hypothesis keeps happening.
Right.
That is how knowledge enriches, right? There is that organic evolution that happens.
Then the other question is that then we come to the last, which is the Vedanta. And very often in modern India, most people talk of Vedanta as if it is Advaita. And most people describe Hinduism as Advaita. I mean, I used to do it myself when I used to be asked. I used to describe it in Advaitin terms until I realized that actually that is not true. There is a clear Advaita element. Then there is the Vishishta Advaita, which I don't understand so much, but I understand is a mix of these two. I don't understand the philosophy so much, but between Advaita, as I see it, it is the whole idea of Brahman, that Brahman is omnipresent and we are all part of, which is where the Maya concept is, that actually we are Brahman, but we think that we are different, which is the part of Maya which plays. The Dvaita, on the other hand, does not think like that. It says that there is a creator, there is God, and there is you. And the best that you can be is a great devotee of Ishvara or Madhava.
I mean, even if you are realized, you are just realized as your jiva. It's not as if you are going to become the para. That's
absolutely. And in popular discourse, it seems that so many of us have completely put that aside.
True, and the reason is the non-Advaita is a very small minority, as a matter of fact.
Right.
That too in the Vedantic sphere.
Right.
They call it Vedantic. I mean, however you phrase it.
Right.
So, technically speaking, any school that gives a commentary to Gita, Brahma Sutras, and Upanishads is a Vedantic Darshana.
Right.
But Advaita, just one point, because there is a reason why people default Advaita as the understanding is Advaita is extremely pervasive.
Yes.
Shankara's Advaita is just one of it. Then you have the Shaiva Shakta version. So there is also a Vaishnava version. So in each of these, there might be differences. Let us say Shankara's is Vivartavada, the Shakta uses Parinamavada, but still these are all Advaitas. And if you look at the school of the overall ecosystem, Advaita is still very dominant. So most people make it an approximate equivalent of
Vedanta.
Hinduism as Advaita.
True. And so here is the limited point that I wanted to make is that Advaita says that everything is Brahman. And the Dvaita element, which at one time, as I understand, was really predominant as a viewpoint, was that there is a jiva and there is whichever creator God there might be. Now, if you look at it, these are so vastly different as just basic concepts.
No, but see, logically, if you derive it, Dvaita in a way derives from Sankhya directly.
Yes.
It's just that you are propounding Ishvara there.
Yes.
But it's basically the multiplicity of Purusha.
Yes.
It is a Sankhya concept that Dvaita directly adopts.
Yes.
Which is where the Vedanta differs from it.
But there are these stark differences. As I said, from what I understand, Vishesha Advaita is a combination of these, of the Dvaita and the Advaitin idea. moving slightly away from this, and I'll sort of circle back, is that in particular in Tamil Nadu, there is this stark difference between the Shaivite and the Vaishnavite, where they will not even enter each other's temples, they
Oh
will
yeah.
eat food, they will not marry. There is that stark a difference. I mean, it is, they would, when they were kings, they would battle with each other even. So it's not as if we are all these ideas are homogeneous and we are all brotherly and friendly. They were actually extremely opposite poles. Um,
True.
and to the extent that if you were a Vaishnavite, you would sort of cast it, you talk about the Shaivites poorly. If you're a Shaivite, maybe you don't talk about the Vaishnavites so poorly, but the Vaishnavites are slightly harder core in terms of looking at the Shaivite or any of the other philosophies. The Shakta, the Devi and the Shaivite would be closer together. They would not be at battle with each other in terms of theology, but these other two, Vaishnava and Shaivite, would be at battle, which is where the Harihara tradition, as you said, it's sort of all
Yeah.
right, calm down, guys, kind of thing. It sort of blends the two ideas. The point that I'm trying to make is out of all this is that the kind of differences that exist between the Shaivite and the Vaishnav, or between the Advaita and the Dvaita, and I'm assuming that Advaita and Dvaita is part of the Vedanta and it is subsects in Vedanta. Speaking for myself, I don't understand the other major schools that well, or major darshanas that well. I'm assuming if sub darshanas can have that much divergence, then the other underlying darshanas, yes, there is some commonality, but they will be stark divergence. That is why you recognize them as different darshanas and not as sub darshanas. What we do know is amongst the sub darshanas, there is that divergence. Amongst the Vaishnava and the Shaiva, there is that divergence. It is over a period and in the context of the onslaught that we incurred in terms of invasions or conquerors, that we sort of started becoming more blended. But in our essence, when what we describe as Hinduism is probably more an agglomeration of different.
Yeah, which is where we'll need to understand that original ecosystem.
Yeah, yeah.
Again, going back, you have that people say there is a Vedic, there is Tantric, there is then Bauddha, all these things. But the Nigamagama traditions, if you see, that is a very harmonious ecosystem from which you had the Kapalikas, the lot of people came. The Bhairavas are there, then your Shaktas are there. Shaktas also so many variants were there, and the Vaishnavas were many variants. You had the Shrautas, you had the Smartas, so a lot of traditions. Each of them had certain overlaps at the practice level, at the philosophy level. They used to have their overlaps, their disagreements, all these things, but this ecosystem continued. It was never having the kind of major denominations that we tend to see Hinduism as. The sense of these denominations and canonizing of things is predominantly a modern understanding of Hinduism.
Yeah, yeah.
So whatever, let us say, Shankara had seen 72 traditions and he harmonized into 6 traditions, but it was never limited to 6 even after Shankara.
Yeah.
It remained countless.
Yeah, yeah.
But yeah, there was some semblance of a superstructure that came, and then it enabled more harmonious interaction between those traditions. That is the best that can be said.
So there is one comment that I would make, and I would seek your reaction to that comment as well. Is that whenever you ask a Brahmin of these differences, you will find some version of what you just described.
Right.
In terms of commonality.
Because he sees the big picture.
Correct. When you talk to a non-Brahmin who is a practitioner, a non-Brahmin is very clear of the difference that exists. I mean, they will say that yes, the Vedas are true, etc., etc. But they have this completely different sense of this is Tantra. This is different from Veda. This is.
I have one counter question.
Yes, yes.
Is Arjuna, Arjuna of the Mahabharata, Is that guy a Vedic or a Tantric guy?
So my answer would be Arjuna is a Vedic who also assimilates Tantra.
But he didn't describe himself that way. He did not put any labels for himself.
Correct, correct.
So what I'm saying is this whole labeling business is a very recent business. For
Understood.
one person to, it is a tradition is in-based in the sense that you look inwards, you try to learn that knowledge, you try to enrich yourself and try to liberate yourself. This whole outward looking and then engaging with the other in a conflicting way is not the essentially Hindu way of doing things.
That is excellent. So
there could be conflict. There were conflicts also at times, and these conflicts, in fact, if you see, you will see the bitter and bloody Shaiva Vaishnava conflict, which was brief. In fact, it was not a very prolonged battle.
Yeah.
But at the same time, you have also seen that there was no external entity like a king who has harmonized these things. These people have solved their problems themselves. So today, if you see in the Dharmasthala, you have a Jaina maintained Shiva temple where the worship is done by the Vaishnavas.
Correct.
Don't get a more harmonious example than that. And there is no, it's not just one exception.
Correct.
People have solved their problems in their own way because their ecosystem was harmonious.
And that's exactly one of my points that I had in my head. Is that this whole need to label ourselves one way or the other is not essentially a tradition true to Bharata.
100%. And I'll give you some 3-4 dimensions to it. One is this whole canonizing of 6 darshanas. We never had it.
Yeah.
Shad darshanas is just a technical term, but Vidyaranya himself lists 16 darshanas. And that just shows that it's not as if you have to fit into one of those 6 just because you are a Nastika. Similarly, Nastikas also had their darshanas. This is one example. Now you had that again, Shaivism, Vaishnavism, Sikhism. This whole ism business is a very recent, very, very recent understanding.
Yes.
Somebody can say, yeah, I am a Shaiva, I am not a Vaidika, which is fine. Nobody cares. You can be anything you want. But you can't at the same time deny that your Shaiva tradition has some very deep overlap with other traditions. And that will be known to people who have invested in that knowledge. If you understand the Agamas and their, let us just take those 36 principles of Shaiva. Where did they come from without 24 principles of Sankhya? So are you related to Veda or not? You can say no. But
or if I were to think, sometimes I think of it like this, is that all these are seeking the truth of the universe of existence.
Absolutely.
And it is fairly possible that not one comes from the other, but amongst the Agama Shastras, they had their version of the truth, which was, so truth is the same. People view it differently, but truth is the same. The Vedics looked at the truth and they also had a truth. But since truth is underlying is the same, there is a commonality, even if its origins might be different. And partly, I don't think that makes sense.
Partly it's basically the Tantra does allude to Veda. It's not as if it says Veda is false knowledge.
Right.
Expressly accepts
correct.
Knowledge.
So none of these people claim that Veda is false knowledge. So there are people, particularly in South India, that assert that Tantra and Agama is older than the Vedas. Now, obviously, when we say older, I mean, the Vedas have always existed. So Veda is the underlying truth of the universe. So, but I think what they mean is in terms of how the sort of the classification may be. So I'm not sure that they're exactly correct. It's probably more political in that sense.
It is, and it is more identity obsessed.
Yes.
You don't need to.
And probably a pushback against what people might see is Brahmanism. So pushback.
Again,